Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, "I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why the bush is not burned up." When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a land good and to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He said, "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain." But Moses said to God, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said further, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this my title for all generations." The word of the Lord. So I remember the first time I ever preached a real sermon. And by real, I mean not an extremely abbreviated version, not in a classroom, and not with a video camera as my sole audience. I was scared to death. I, at that time, had 2 young children, not even in grade school yet, and I had left a successful career to go back to school and had not even finished my first year, had never taken a preaching class. So to say that I was nervous is a bit of an understatement. I had all the signs. I was shaking. My heart felt like it was going to pound out of my chest. I thought I might throw up at any moment, which would be perfect. And doubts were just swirling in my head. Was I ready for this? Did I know what I was doing? Who did I think I was anyway? My palms were so sweaty as the choir finished singing their anthem, signaling to me that I should head to the pulpit. Luckily, in that church, I was sitting behind this kind of half wall and well over to the side, so most people couldn't see me as I dried my palms on my pants as I began to walk over to the lectern that seemed 25 feet away, but it was really only about 5 feet. And that's when I felt it. Now, let me just say before I tell you what I felt, that I had carefully planned my wardrobe for that day. My first sermon, I wanted to be not too dressy because, of course, I wanted to be comfortable. But I wanted to appear like I was professional, too. Nothing too casual. Navy pants, button-down, white-collared shirt, conservative. Heels, just a little bit, not too much elevation. And definitely, those shoes were closed-toed. A friend of mine was in an internship in a nearby church, and she had been reprimanded her first Sunday of preaching for not tying her beautiful red hair behind her face when she preached, and for wearing open-toed shoes. Heaven forbid someone see her toes. Now, it tells you a little bit about the time to say that I had thought about pulling my hair back so that I wouldn't offend anyone, but I had not even considered the fact that my shoes might offend someone before she told me her story. So, unfortunately, at this point, my well-thought-out wardrobe was failing me already, because what I felt when I stood up was that my feet were just as sweaty as my hands. And my shoes had just enough heel in them that when I walked over to the pulpit, which was a lot like this one, except it also had sides on it, I realized that I was either going to have to hold on to that pulpit for dear life so I wouldn't slide forward, or I was going to have to lose the shoes. So it wasn't something that I really thought about much at all. I just kicked my shoes off. Now, I can't tell you what I preached on that day. I can't tell you what the title of my sermon was, or what passage we were studying, or any of that. I can't tell you what people said after the sermon was over. But I can tell you how I felt before I took my shoes off and after I took my shoes off. See, all that anxiety and nervousness, it kind of just went away. And for a moment, I suddenly felt like I was just me. I was grounded, somehow connected to the earth, even though I was really standing on a beautiful shade of mauve carpet that was all over the sanctuary. But for that moment, I felt as though the earth was holding me up, that there was energy underneath my feet that was supporting me, cradling me almost. I was no longer uncomfortable in the slippery dampness of my soles. I was marveling, really, at how I got there, what led me there, what I was doing with my life, and staring out at all the faces looking back at me, and all at once seeming to soak it all in. The words, the music, the prayers, the worship, it hit me all at once. And it made me wonder, how many more moments in my life had I forgotten to show up and receive with my whole self? How many moments in my life had flown by me without me ever noticing or inviting God to enter into them with me? All of that, yes, because I took my shoes off. Shoes. They're not mentioned that many times in the Old Testament, believe it or not. There's that time in the book of Joshua when the mysterious commander of the army of the Lord commands Joshua to remove his sandals, for he is standing on holy ground, and Joshua does so. There's the time in the book of Ruth when Boaz, and Ruth's next of kin, who has the first right of refusal to take Ruth as his wife, exchange sandals to seal a deal where Boaz would acquire a field and Ruth as his wife. So they take off a sandal and give one to the other. And like Ruth, then Deuteronomy and Amos have short references to shoes being used in rites, parties removing their sandals in order to nullify previously binding legal ties so that they can begin new relationships, new claims, and have new responsibility. In the book of Exodus, the Hebrews are instructed to prepare for the Passover and to eat the Passover meal with their shoes on. And later in Deuteronomy and Joshua, these instructions are referenced, and we are told that that was a way to signify their readiness to make the journey. And that's pretty much it. I guess that most of my life, I assumed that God wanted Moses to remove his sandals in this passage because God thought Moses ought to just show some respect. And that even the physical location upon which Moses stood was somehow inherently special and holy too because God was there. And I know that I'm not the only person in the world to ever think this. Now, this is always backed up by some of our popular Christian culture that we see all the time. Like, for instance, evidence number 1, Charlton Heston's portrayal of Moses in the movie The Ten Commandments, which only won one Academy Award, by the way. Does anyone know what for? Oh, I think I heard it. Visual effects. It won for visual effects, so all of you should go back and check out that burning bush. It's worth it. And then later there's the animated film, The Prince of Egypt, which most of us showed our children, mine loved it, or our grandchildren, and we buy it. Then also all of these popular pilgrimages to holy sites that I myself have been on, where taking pictures, talking, and wearing shoes is discouraged. So my assumption then that all of this is done so that Moses can show some respect for God and for the ground, well, I'm wondering if that's true. It's because what would happen to Moses if he didn't remove his shoes? I'll tell you what I thought. I thought that if he didn't remove his shoes, that burning bush was going to burn him up too. And I have an active imagination, I will admit that. But I will also tell you that's what I really thought for most of my life. And the church did not make me dispute it. But now that I'm looking at the story again, I'm beginning to doubt because of where this story takes us. If you look at it, see, Moses' removal of his sandals doesn't suddenly make him more respectful and full of reverence. He doesn't finish out this chapter bowing down to God or speaking only in hushed tones or showing much reverence at all for anything. When God tells Moses that he is the person that needs to go to Egypt and that God will send him to Pharaoh and that convinced him to let the people go, Moses isn't convinced. So much for pyrotechnics and voices coming out of bushes. Moses is not impressed. He doesn't obey God's every command. In fact, he questions everything God says and then lays out a list of good excuses, 4 of them to be exact, as to why God has a very bad plan. Now, I'll give you a warning. These excuses may sound familiar, especially if you've been asked to consider being a trustee, a deacon, or an elder this year. But they're familiar to all of us. Excuse number 1. Who am I to go and do this? I'm a nobody. I'm an orphan, a wannabe Egyptian murderer, and escape artist outlaw. Excuse number 2, verse 13. Who are you? I don't even know you. I don't even know what your name is. It's not like we have this close relationship, God. Excuse number 3, chapter 4, verse 1. But what if they don't like me? What if they don't listen to me or believe me? What if they laugh at me and think I'm a joke? Excuse number 4, chapter 4, verse 10. I don't have the gifts for this. Have you ever heard me speak, God? Clearly you would know I do not have the gifts for this if you had. And then when none of these excuses work, in chapter 4, verse 13, Moses finally just tells God he doesn't want to do it. Oh, my Lord, please send someone else. Can't you see it would just be better if you picked someone else? So God, asking Moses to remove his sandals as a show of reverence and respect, well, given the evidence, I'm not sure I can buy that story anymore. But then why does God ask Moses to remove his sandals? I think there are clues in the text. If we look back at chapter 2, verse 22, Moses calls himself an alien residing in a foreign land. But if you remember about Moses' life, there's not been a place in his life where he could ever really be himself. Yes, he was raised by his Hebrew mother, but probably unbeknownst to him. And then he was adopted by Pharaoh's daughter and given an Egyptian name, but he knew that he never really belonged there. And when he finally tries to help his own people, it ends badly when he murders an Egyptian. And then his own people reject him, fearing that if he got angry with them, he might murder them too. And then Pharaoh, his grandfather, searches him out to kill him, and Moses has to flee. So Moses had to begin his life hiding the fact that he was a Hebrew. And then he tries to erase the fact that he grew up in an Egyptian household, only to be recognized by the women at the well in Midian as an Egyptian. So from a basket to a house of royalty, to now schlumping it as a shepherd for his father-in-law, in a field as an alien residing in a foreign land, it is no wonder Moses has no idea about these gifts that he possesses. And then the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame, a fire out of a bush. He looked, and the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Then Moses said, I must turn aside and look at this great sight and see why it is not burned up. The way that this reads strikes me every time, because it's like not everyone would have turned aside to see this bush. But Moses did. He saw something there. He didn't quite know what it was yet or what it meant yet, but he knew he wanted to see a little more of it. And listen to what happens after that. When the Lord saw that he had turned aside to see, God called to him out of the bush. When the Lord God saw that he had turned aside to see, when the Lord saw that Moses had noticed something else, devoted his full attention, when the Lord saw Moses wasn't thinking about just himself or who he was or how he got there or what he had or hadn't done or what he could be doing, if only then God called to him out of a bush, come no closer, remove your sandals, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. Remove your sandals. Touch the soil. Remember who you are. Let yourself be rooted in this holy ground that is you and is yet more than you, in this holy ground that shaped even the first human being and every plant and animal and tree for food and of knowledge of good and evil. Be rooted here in your whole story. Remember, this is the dirt that was cursed on humans' behalf and would receive each human back again after their death. Be rooted in this soil and the promises from the very first story that you must care for and tend the good gifts of creation. Be rooted in the ground that will yield offerings up to God and open its mouth to receive the blood of the slain and give voice to injustice. Be grounded here in the thing that connects you to everything. The soil that forms us, that feeds us, receives us, and ultimately makes a claim upon us. Be rooted here, where you first took notice. God demands that Moses stand there for a moment in shoeless wonder and marvel at it all, the entirety of the moment of who he is and where he came from and what he's doing there and how he's called to be and use his gifts that God gave him. And just when Moses thinks that he's done, that he's washed up and washed out, that he has nothing more to give, that he's doomed to wander with the sheep as an alien in a foreign land, God shows up and calls him to see something more. Being oneself isn't always easy. We think often that we have to be someone else when we approach a chore. It's rarely something that comes naturally. Parker Palmer talks about this in his book, Let Your Life Speak. He says, we arrive in this world with birthright gifts. Then we spend the first half of our lives abandoning them or letting others persuade us that they're not worthwhile gifts. God sees something in Moses, just as Moses sees something in that bush. And what God sees, Moses isn't yet prepared to see fully. And God asked Moses to do something that Moses thinks he's not prepared to do at all. But the God who claims the name, I am who I am the God of your ancestors. I am the God of your father, and the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, reminds Moses, I'm your God too, and I will be with you. This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations. Amen.